There's a certain image that gets burned into basically everyone's brain the moment they first learn about dinosaurs, and that image is almost always the same. A colossal reptilian head, banana-sized teeth, tiny useless arms, and a name that's become basically synonymous with the entire concept of prehistoric power. Tyrannosaurus rex. And look, I get it. The marketing has been relentless for over a century now. Every documentary, every toy aisle, every movie franchise built on genetically engineered chaos has cemented this one dinosaur as the undisputed heavyweight champion of the Mesozoic. The apex of apex predators. The final boss of the Cretaceous. Except here's the thing nobody really tells you in elementary school, and it's a little bit of a bombshell if you've spent your whole life assuming T-Rex was the biggest, baddest thing to ever stomp around on land. It wasn't, not even close, depending on how you're measuring things. In fact, there were multiple theropods, the group of two-legged, mostly carnivorous dinosaurs that T-Rex belongs to, that were flat out bigger than it, and yet somehow these animals remain almost totally unknown to the general public. So today, we're benching the king of the tyrant lizards for a bit, and instead shining a light on the theropods that actually outsized it, because their stories are honestly just as wild, if not wilder. Let's start with the heavyweight of heavyweights, the dinosaur that when you actually crunch the numbers, comes out on top of pretty much every size comparison chart that includes it, and that's Spinosaurus. Now, chances are you've at least heard the name, mostly thanks to its memorable and admittedly kind of chaotic role in one of the Jurassic Park sequels, where it was depicted snapping a T-Rex's neck in a fight that, frankly, paleontologists have been arguing about the plausibility of ever since. But putting aside Hollywood theatrics for a second, the real Spinosaurus was an absolute unit in its own right, and arguably one of the strangest large predators to have ever existed. Based on current estimates, adult Spinosaurus could reach lengths of somewhere between 12 and 18 meters, or roughly 39 to 59 feet, which for context would make it noticeably longer than even the biggest T-Rex specimens on record, who typically topped out around 12 to 13 meters at most. And in terms of raw weight, some estimates put Spinosaurus at somewhere between 7 and 20 tons, depending on which reconstruction you're going off of, since honestly the fossil record for this animal has been a bit of a mess historically. As it turns out, most of the original Spinosaurus material, discovered way back in the early 1900s in Egypt, was actually destroyed during a bombing raid in World War II, meaning paleontologists spent decades working with basically nothing but old sketches and photographs of bones that no longer physically existed. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty wild way to have to reconstruct one of the largest predators to ever walk, or in this case swim, the Earth. And that brings us to maybe the most bizarre and paradigm-shifting part of the Spinosaurus story, which is that more recent fossil discoveries starting in the 2000s, and continuing into the 2010s and 2020s, have suggested this animal wasn't even primarily a land hunter in the traditional sense. Instead, Spinosaurus appears to have been a semi-aquatic predator, one that spent an enormous amount of its time actually in the water, hunting large fish and other aquatic prey along river systems in what is now North Africa. And the physical evidence backing this up is honestly pretty compelling. Its bones show a density pattern similar to modern aquatic animals like hippos and penguins, an adaptation that helps with buoyancy control underwater. Its tail, meanwhile, was recently found to be paddle-shaped and remarkably deep, essentially functioning like a giant fin that would have made it a surprisingly capable swimmer. And then there's that iconic sail on its back, a massive dorsal structure built from elongated spines, which likely served some combination of purposes, whether that be temperature regulation, visual display to attract mates or intimidate rivals, or possibly all of the above. So essentially, you're talking about a predator that may have looked less like a typical land-based theropod, and more like some kind of nightmarish, elongated crocodile-dinosaur hybrid, casually cruising river systems and picking off massive prehistoric fish, some of which, mind you, were themselves absolutely enormous, including species like Onchopristes, a sawfish relative that could grow to be several meters long on its own. And given that Spinosaurus likely spent much of its life partially submerged, some researchers have even speculated it might have had a diet dominated almost entirely by fish, making it functionally more comparable to a giant, scaly heron than anything resembling the traditional image of a rampaging land predator. Though to be fair, the debate over exactly how aquatic Spinosaurus really was is still very much ongoing within the paleontology community, with some researchers pushing back on just how much time it spent in the water versus on land. But if Spinosaurus feels a little too weird and aquatic for your taste, and you're looking for something that's a bit more of a traditional land-based bone-crushing terror, then let's head over to South America, because that's where we find Giganotosaurus, a name that, appropriately enough, literally translates to giant southern lizard. This predator lived in what is now Argentina during the late Cretaceous, and it belongs to a group of theropods known as Carcharodontosaurids, a lineage that, despite sounding similar to Tyrannosaurus in casual conversation, is actually only very distantly related to it, having evolved its massive size completely independently. And in terms of scale, Giganotosaurus was seriously impressive, with length estimates typically landing somewhere between 12 and 13 meters, or about 39 to 43 feet, putting it right in the same ballpark as, and by some measurements slightly exceeding, the largest known T-Rex specimens. Now weight-wise, Giganotosaurus was likely somewhat lighter than T-Rex, with estimates generally hovering around 6 to 8 tons compared to T-Rex's roughly 8 to 9 tons at the high end, which does mean that in terms of raw mass, T-Rex may have actually still held the edge. But lengthwise and especially skull-wise, Giganotosaurus had some genuinely wild proportions, sporting a skull that could stretch close to 1.8 meters long, lined with dozens of blade-like serrated teeth that were clearly built for slicing through flesh in a slashing style of attack, rather than the bone-crushing, high-bite force approach that T-Rex is famous for. And this distinction actually matters a lot when you think about how these two animals would have hunted. Whereas T-Rex is believed to have possessed one of the strongest bite forces of any known terrestrial animal, capable of literally crushing bone, Giganotosaurus's teeth and jaw structure suggest a very different strategy, one built around delivering rapid, slashing bites to weaken, and eventually bleed out much larger prey over time. A hunting style that some researchers think may have made it particularly well-suited to taking down the absolutely massive long-necked sauropods that shared its ecosystem, including Tyrannosaurs that could weigh multiple times more than Giganotosaurus itself. And speaking of taking down prey that outweighs you significantly, that brings us to one of the more fascinating aspects of this predator's likely behavior, which is that Giganotosaurus may not have hunted alone. Based on bone bed evidence found in Argentina, where multiple individuals of a closely related Carcharodontosaurid called Mapusaurus were discovered together in the same location, researchers have proposed that these giant theropods may have engaged in some form of pack or group hunting behavior, banding together specifically to take down the enormous sauropods that would have otherwise been far too large and dangerous for any single predator to tackle solo. Now, to be clear, this remains a topic of pretty active scientific debate, since proving actual coordinated pack behavior in dinosaurs is notoriously difficult based on fossil evidence alone, and there are alternative explanations, like these animals simply congregating opportunistically around a shared food source rather than actively hunting together as a coordinated unit. But if it does turn out to be true, even in some loose form, it paints an absolutely wild picture of prehistoric South America, one where groups of giant, slashing-toothed predators the size of school buses were working together to bring down animals that dwarfed even them, which frankly sounds like something straight out of a nightmare nature documentary that thankfully nobody has to actually witness in person. Now sticking with the Carcharodontosaurid family for a moment, since apparently this particular lineage really had a thing for producing absolute units, we've got to talk about Pteranodon, another South American giant that lived slightly earlier than Giganotosaurus, during the early Cretaceous, also in what is now Argentina. And despite being somewhat less famous, mostly due to having a less complete fossil record, Pteranodon was still an enormous predator in its own right, with length estimates suggesting it could reach somewhere between 12.2 and 13.2 meters, once again putting it comfortably in the same size range as, or potentially exceeding, T-Rex. Its name, fittingly, translates to Tyrant Titan, which honestly might be one of the more accurately descriptive dinosaur names out there, given just how large this thing actually was. Unfortunately, because much of its skeleton remains undiscovered, with researchers working off a relatively incomplete set of remains including parts of the skull, vertebrae, and limb bones, we don't know quite as much about Pteranodon's specific hunting behavior or ecology compared to some of its more famous cousins. But based purely on its anatomy, which closely resembles other Carcharodontosaurids, it's reasonable to assume it followed a broadly similar slashing, blade-toothed predatory strategy, likely going after the abundant sauropods that dominated South American ecosystems during this period. And what's honestly kind of remarkable when you step back and look at the bigger picture here, is just how many of these Carcharodontosaurid giants existed across different time periods and continents, essentially operating as this entire parallel dynasty of massive predators that were evolving independently of, but converging on similar gigantic body plans as the Tyrannosaurs that would eventually become famous much later on. Speaking of convergent evolution producing terrifying results, let's actually head over to Africa now, Because there's one more contender worth mentioning here, and that's Carcharodontosaurus, the theropod that this entire family of giant predators is actually named after. Discovered originally in North Africa, in areas that are now part of Morocco and Egypt, Carcharodontosaurus lived during roughly the same time period as Spinosaurus, meaning these two massive predators were likely coexisting, and in some cases potentially competing within overlapping territories, which honestly sounds like an absolutely terrifying ecosystem to have existed in. In terms of size, Carcharodontosaurus is estimated to have reached lengths of somewhere around 12 to 13 meters as well, once again landing it firmly in that same tier as T-Rex, or arguably slightly above it, depending on which specific specimens you're comparing. Its name appropriately translates to shark-toothed lizard, a reference to its serrated blade-like teeth that bear a genuinely striking resemblance to the teeth of large predatory sharks, both in shape and in their clear adaptation for slicing through flesh rather than crushing through bone. And given that Carcharodontosaurus and Spinosaurus were sharing the same general region and time period, there's been quite a bit of speculation among paleontologists about how exactly these two absolute giants divided up their ecological niches to avoid constantly competing directly with one another. The leading theory suggests that Spinosaurus, being semi-aquatic, likely focused most of its hunting efforts on fish and other prey within river systems and waterways, while Carcharodontosaurus, being a more traditional, fully terrestrial predator, probably focused its attention on hunting large land-dwelling herbivores, allowing both of these massive theropods to coexist without necessarily having to constantly go head-to-head over the exact same food sources. Now, with all of this said, it's worth pausing for a second to address the obvious question that's probably been nagging at you throughout this entire video, which is, okay, if all of these dinosaurs were bigger than T-Rex, then why on earth is T-Rex still the one everyone knows about? And honestly, the answer comes down to a combination of several different factors that have very little to do with actual size, and a whole lot to do with fossil completeness, geographic accessibility, and frankly, just old-fashioned marketing and cultural momentum. T-Rex fossils, particularly ones discovered in North America, tend to be exceptionally well-preserved and remarkably complete compared to a lot of these other giant theropods, many of which, as we've covered, are known from frustratingly incomplete or in some cases entirely lost fossil material. And on top of that, T-Rex was discovered relatively early, back in the early 1900s, giving it over a century's worth of head start in terms of cultural saturation, compared to animals like Giganotosaurus or Pteranodon, which weren't even formally described until the 1990s or early 2000s. And then, of course, there's the simple fact that T-Rex does still hold some legitimately impressive records of its own, even if total length and overall size aren't necessarily among them. Its bite force, for instance, is estimated to have been absolutely massive, likely one of the strongest of any terrestrial animal to have ever existed, dinosaur or otherwise, capable of exerting pressures that could genuinely pulverize bone, a trait that none of the Carcharodontosaurids or Spinosaurus are believed to have shared to nearly the same degree, since their teeth were built more for slicing than crushing. So in a weird way, comparing T-Rex to these other giant theropods isn't really a fair apples-to-apples comparison at all, because you're essentially comparing two completely different predatory strategies that happen to converge on similarly massive body sizes. On one hand, you've got T-Rex, representing this bone-crushing, high bite force approach, likely built for taking down and completely dismantling prey through sheer, overwhelming power. And on the other hand, you've got this entire separate lineage of Carcharodontosaurids, along with the bizarre semi-aquatic outlier that is Spinosaurus, representing a totally different slashing, blade-toothed predatory style, one built more around inflicting massive wounds and letting blood loss and shock do a lot of the heavy lifting over time. And what's honestly kind of fascinating about all of this, when you really sit with it, is that evolution essentially ran two completely separate, independent experiments in building the biggest possible theropod predator, on two entirely different continents, using two entirely different genetic starting points, and arrived at two wildly different but equally terrifying end results. It's honestly one of the better examples out there of convergent evolution at an absolutely massive scale, where similar ecological pressures, in this case the presence of enormous, well-defended prey animals like sauropods, pushed completely unrelated groups of predators toward remarkably similar overall body sizes, even while their actual hunting tools and strategies ended up being fundamentally different from one another. And really, when you step back and look at the full picture here, it becomes pretty clear that the Mesozoic wasn't just some simple, single timeline story with one ultimate apex predator reigning supreme across the entire era. It was instead this sprawling, constantly shifting patchwork of different ecosystems, spread across different continents and different time periods, each one producing its own set of absolutely massive, terrifying predators that we're often completely unaware of and evolutionarily unrelated to one another. T-Rex just so happened to be the one that got the best publicist, so to speak, thanks to a combination of lucky fossil preservation, early discovery, and just generally being in the right place at the right time to capture the public's imagination. But Spinosaurus, Giganotosaurus, Pteranodon, and Carcharodontosaurus were all out there too, at various points, doing their own thing, being just as large, just as dangerous, and honestly just as deserving of a spot in the cultural spotlight. So the next time someone confidently tells you that T-Rex was the biggest predator to ever walk the earth, you'll at least know there's a whole lineup of enormous blade-toothed contenders who might have something to say about that. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Lost Predators.